Good evening. Welcome to the Cincinnati Art Museum. Thank you for staying cool with us tonight. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Julie Aronson, and I'm the museum's curator of American painting, sculpture, and drawings, and the curator of our newly opened exhibition, Henry Mosler Behind the Scenes, which I hope if you have not yet had the opportunity to see it, that you will truly enjoy. This exhibition is the Cincinnati Art Museum's contribution to the Jewish Cincinnati Bicentennial, which is a citywide celebration of 200 years of Jewish life in Cincinnati and the many Jewish contributions to the rich history and vibrancy of the city. There are a lot of events associated with the Jewish Cincinnati Bicentennial, so I encourage you, they have a website set up with events, and I encourage you to have a look at that if you're looking for other things that are going on around town. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many organizations who supported this exhibition, including the Jewish Cincinnati Bicentennial and Jewish Federation, the Jewish Foundation, and the Ohio Humanities Council, who generously supported the exhibition and this evening's program. One small housekeeping detail, I'd just like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. So tonight you're in for a fascinating lecture. Our speaker is Samantha Baskind, professor of art history at Cleveland State University. Dr. Baskind received her doctorate from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is the author of 5 books, including the Encyclopaedia of Jewish American Artists, which came out in 2007, and most recently, The Warsaw Ghetto and American Art and Culture. She's contributed a wealth of articles and reviews on art, identity, and religion to museum catalogues, academic journals, encyclopedias, and the mainstream press. She has served as editor for the United States in the 22-volume revised edition, for Art of the United States, I should say, in the 22-volume revised edition of the Encyclopaedia Judaica, and is the series editor of Dimyonot, Jews and the Cultural Imagination, published by Penn State University Press, which is a series. Her current project should be of great interest to those of you familiar with the collections of the Cincinnati Art Museum, which is a book on the American sculptor Moses Jacob Ezekiel, who will figure in her lecture this evening, Jewish American Artists and the Gilded Age. Please join me in wishing a warm welcome to Samantha Baskind.
Can you hear me? Great. So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I love Cincinnati. There is so much wealth of culture in your city. It's a pleasure. And today I'm here to talk about 2 contributors to the wealth in your city, Moses Ezekiel and Henry Mosler. You're looking at a photograph of Ezekiel from around 1900 and Mosler's self-portrait from 1907. The self-portrait is in the exhibition. And we're looking here at 2 artists who are very serious in their intent. They're serious in their work, which is very academic. We're going to talk about some of the similarities and differences, and there's a lot of similarities. Among them are they had some training in Cincinnati. They lived in Cincinnati at various times. Mosler came and went. Ezekiel lived here for a short period of time. And we'll talk about sort of why they were here and what they got from the city that's very amenable to artists in the 19th century. Hiram Powers was here. There's a great Hiram Powers sculpture, many in your galleries. So Ezekiel they're both Jewish, and it's thrilling to be here for the 200th anniversary of Jews in Cincinnati. They're both Jewish, but Ezekiel was in America for a long time. He is not an immigrant. His family was one of the first settlers in this country. And he's a Sephardic Jew, meaning he's a Jew from Spanish descent. Versus Mosler is a Ashkenazi Jew. He was an immigrant. He came here with his family at a young age from Germany, a German area. And they both were expatriates. They both realized that to get the training that they hoped to have, they needed to go to Europe. And they both did. They both went to Germany and they studied there, though Mosler was more peripatetic. He went to a lot of places. I want to begin with a particular sculpture by Ezekiel. It's Religious Liberty. It's from 1876. It's in Philadelphia. Because this is the theme of why Jewish American artists could thrive in the Gilded Age. It's because of the religious liberty afforded them in this country. So this is religious liberty. It's not, I'm showing you in its older, where it used to stand, because we can see it more clearly. But this is the first monument commissioned by a Jewish fraternal organization in this country. That's the B'nai B'rith. It's a brotherhood of Jews. The B'nai B'rith still exists. And in fact, my son is in Israel with this group right now. So this is religious liberty dedicated to the people of the United States by the Order B'nai B'rith and Israelites of America. It was the B'nai B'rith's contribution to the centennial, 1876, the Centennial Exhibition celebrating the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this was a huge deal. The brothers got money. They paid for it themselves. They hired a young, untried sculptor at this point, Moses Ezekiel, who, and I don't want to skirt all the facts here, he lived in Richmond, Virginia, which is an unusual place for a Jewish boy to be raised. And he did go to the Virginia Military Institute, and he fought on the Confederate side. He was a teenager. He was conscripted. But it's a reality, and it's something that is a very rich conversation that needs to be had. I can't have it right now because we're talking about the Jewish dimensions of his work, but if there's questions at the end, I'm glad to answer them. So Ezekiel has gone to Germany. He's received some academic training. He wins a prize. He ends up spending 40 years in Rome. He's an expat for his entire life in Rome, his adult life. He's commissioned to make this sculpture. He's given pretty much free rein to do what he wants. There's an allegorical liberty up top. She raises her hand. She's, blessing those underneath her. Then we have faith. She's especially blessing faith. He's a boy. And then over here, an American eagle is attacking a serpent, the serpent of intolerance. So it's very allegorical, it's very academic. It did not make it to the centennial. Ezekiel was a perfectionist, and the B'nai B'rith didn't pay up as fast as they were supposed to. But it did come in November of the same year. The centennial exhibition had closed. It does arrive. This is the program for it. And I want to point out that this program is in the American Jewish Archives, which is on Hebrew Union College's campus. It's a tremendous resource. I'm not just talking about for Ezekiel. I read Ezekiel's personal papers they have. They have photographs I found of his studio. They have the B'nai B'rith papers. There's so much there. This is why I love Cincinnati. You've got this art museum. You have the archives. You have the Skirball Museum. This is a little bit of a closer up, so you can see what's going on. B'nai B'rith only had one request, that faith holds a light. It's the eternal light. It's something that you would find in Jewish synagogues. And so that was a request. That was just like a little nod of Jewishness that they wanted. But besides that, there's nothing Jewish about this sculpture besides the fact that it's proclaiming religious liberty. But religious liberty is not just for Jews. Religious liberty should be for everyone if you're not the Christian white, dominant group. But besides that, Ezekiel was really creative, always. He did made little nuances in his sculptures to get us thinking. Do you see that Liberty's hand is kind of funny? Like, who holds their fingers like that? Spock, exactly. Spock does. And Spock was doing, so like this, the Vulcan, whatever it was called. This is the sign. This is actually a priestly blessing in Judaism. So notice that in this angle. And to give you a sense of the scale, this is me. And I'm 5 feet tall. And this sculpture is a towering sculpture. And it weighs over 10 tons. just another view of it. Liberty has her hand on fasces. There's the Constitution above that. So in sum, Ezekiel is very much an academic artist. In part, that's why he's sometimes forgotten to history, because this is around the time that avant-garde art becomes really prevalent. Here's Ezekiel in his studio. I did find this photograph in the American Jewish Archives. There's Ezekiel, and there's the clay model for religious liberty up on top. And I can identify all these other sculptures too. It's really a great resource. So to go back to this sculpture, and then we'll move on. This is the sculpture in front of the National Museum of American Jewish History, where it stands now. It's no longer in Fairmount Park, where it was for a very long time. And Ezekiel, what artists work through, they have a process. So out there in your exhibition, you see Mosler's process. You see his sketches and how he gets to where he wanted to be with his final canvases. And Ezekiel did the same thing in clay. So right here, you can see that religious liberty just has her hand kind of tepidly stretched out. No fingers are moving in any direction. This is just an early try. And you can see it closer. It's a nuance, right? If this is the priestly blessing, this is a nuance that only Jewish Americans might notice. And when I showed this to my Jewish art class, and most of my students are Jewish, I didn't say anything. And one of them said, "Is she giving the priestly blessing?" So I think a lot of 19th century Jewish Americans would see that nod into what was supposed to be a universal sculpture, and it really was for most, but there's a connection to Jews. And that's an example of the priestly blessing on a tombstone. An ancient one from the 18th century. Religious liberty was celebrated by Jews. Ezekiel was very well known in his time. He was the artist of choice when it came to Jewish material. And it served as the frontispiece and the cover for a book extolling Jews in the military, because there was a canard that Jews didn't really fight for their country. They were still more connected to their Jewishness. They didn't care about America as much as they cared about their religion. This is books trying to prove that it's not true, and it surely does. There were postcards with religious liberty. This is her in Fairmount Park. And there was different years, there were different kind of plantings around it. These cacti are kind of interesting. I tried to figure it out. I think it has something to do with maybe a Middle Eastern feel. Not positive. The desert. So here's another sculpture by Ezekiel. This was in the Cincinnati Art Museum. I want to focus on some works that were here or are here. So it was supposed to go to the Centennial. It's a huge plaster head of Washington. It was supposed to go to the Centennial. It didn't make it in time. It was lost in transit. Ezekiel's brother, Henry, lived here in Cincinnati, and ultimately, when it was found, he made sure it found a home. It came here. It's gigantic. It was plaster, and it's disappeared, or just fell apart. It's no longer here, and it happens. It's plaster. And Ezekiel's trying to fit in, right? Lots of artists make sculptures of Washington or Jefferson, and he was very patriotic in that way. And I simply wanted to point out, this is Christ in the Tomb by Ezekiel. It was a sculpture that is now in a church in Paris. And I'm showing it to you because he does the priestly blessing again, if you can see that hand. So Jesus, a Jew, Ezekiel wants to show his Jewishness. Ezekiel does this a lot. So that's, he's very much contributing to Jewish American culture and imbuing his art with Jewish material and ideas. Isn't that drapery beautiful? And here at the museum, right here in Cincinnati, we have this Jesus, very intense Jesus with the crown of thorns. And Ezekiel wrote in his memoir, he wrote an extensive memoir, that he wanted this Jesus to look Jewish. I'm not so sure, what Jewish looks like is a little bit debatable, but he said that he gave him stronger features and a stronger nose. This is playing on a stereotype, but I'm just reporting the facts. And this is another Ezekiel here in the museum. It's in Gallery 120. And who's seen it? All right, good, most of you. If not, go to Gallery 120 after the talk if the museum's still open. Is it? No. All right. So come back tomorrow. And this is a beautiful sculpture. And Ezekiel had this period where he made biblical works. I don't want to misinform you. He didn't always do biblical works. I'm focusing on some of them because a lot of them are here in Cincinnati. But he did many, many portraits, many of Cincinnatians. He lived here for a period of time when his family moved to Cincinnati after the war. Richmond was ravaged. They needed somewhere to live. They chose Cincinnati. Ezekiel's sister, Hannah Ezekiel, who married a Workham, and she came here, and the family, made deep roots. Jacob Ezekiel is Moses Jacob Ezekiel's dad. I know that's complicated. So Jacob Ezekiel was very involved in the Jewish community. He also was a proponent of religious liberty. He wrote a letter to the president once, which is in the American Jewish Archives, saying, let's not call the American people the Christian people, right? We're the people. So here we have Eve with this, she has the apple, she hears the voice. Eve hears the voice, that's God's voice, and she feels her shame. This is the only full nude that Ezekiel ever made. This is a bronze sculpture. And what's interesting about it, I think, well, a lot of things are interesting. In particular, what I think is interesting is Ezekiel closely read the Bible, and if Eve is made from Adam's rib, then she shouldn't have a belly button. So he has her with a belly button in his clay model, but when he ultimately makes her, she does not have a belly button. Also in Gallery 120 is Judith, and this is a half-length marble. It's a different medium that he used. And Judith in the Bible was a strong woman, and she defeats a general. She saves her people. And this is interesting. She's got a tallis around her waist, which is a Jewish prayer shawl. Women don't, well, now they do, but back then they wouldn't wear a Jewish prayer shawl. And we can see the tassels of it, and on the side are some Jewish stars of David. And she's very stern. Please go see her tomorrow. And then Ezekiel never shied from his Jewishness. He was a lifelong bachelor who lived in Cincinnati, who lived in Richmond, and who lived in Rome for 40 years. No matter what, he never gave up his Jewishness. His mother died in Cincinnati. He sat Shiva for her in Rome, meaning he did traditional Jewish mourning practice in Rome. And here's a menorah in his studio. This is another 19th century studio photograph I found at the archives around the corner. And Alfred Stieglitz is a major, one of the most important American photographers, and he really brought photography to legitimacy in this as an art form. He took this photograph of Judith being carted from Oak Lawn to the Hill, the way art moves. Edward Stieglitz was one of Alfred's dads, was one of Ezekiel's patrons. And Edward Stieglitz was very Victorian. He liked traditional art. He had one. This is not the Judith bust that's here. There was a couple. This is a marble. The Stieglitz family moves. It's being carted to the new place. It's just kind of thrown into this wood cart, taken down the hill. And this is a true story. Alfred Stieglitz was married to Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe was a modernist. She hated this sculpture. She buried it in the backyard and no one ever found it. It's gone. Thank you for having your beautiful version here. Also in the collection here at the Cincinnati Art Museum is this Longfellow. This was funded by a very generous donor. She consulted with the museum and said, what would you like? They decided a Longfellow. Longfellow helped create that moniker of the Queen City. So it's an apt sculpture. It's monument. It's very large. It's not just a normal bust size. It's big. And Ezekiel did many sculptures. He loved the arts. He loved poetry. He loved literature. This is a Shelley. He also did a Shelley for the Keats Shelley House. It was a commission in Rome. And, oh good, we got time. This is his Thomas Jefferson. He was commissioned by the government for the vice president. They have busts of the vice presidents in the Senate chamber. And they tried to get artists who were from the state as the vice president to do the work, if possible. Ezekiel's a Virginian. He loved his state. He was a Southerner at heart always. Being a Southerner, like his love of the South in Virginia was almost like his other religion besides Judaism. And so this is Thomas Jefferson, two different views. Can you see that yellow square I put up there? Next time you watch the news and they're in the chamber, that's Thomas Jefferson by Moses Jacob Ezekiel. Isn't that cool? And he did this life-size Thomas Jefferson. It's relevant because it tells us something about Jewish freedom, Jewish religious freedom. This is in front of the Metro Hall in Louisville. Not far away, you could go visit it. You could have a Moses Jacob Ezekiel day here, go see this. It's huge, and this was a commission from two Jews, very wealthy philanthropists, who made money in the whiskey business, Isaac and Bernard Bernheim. And they commissioned Ezekiel and gave this sculpture to the city to thank America for their religious freedom. Jefferson penned the Virginia Statute for religious freedom. So they chose this subject. They had Ezekiel make it. Ezekiel made a copy eventually. That's at UVA, University of Virginia, in front of the rotunda. Jefferson founded UVA. And these women around the bell are interesting. They all, one is justice. They're all allegorical. Ezekiel loved allegory. It's like he kind of got over the top sometimes with this, but I want to focus on this figure. It's the Brotherhood of Man. Those are Ezekiel's words. Essentially, it's religious liberty. And what makes it so interesting is this tablet that she holds, where you have lots of all different gods, Jehovah and Brahma and Ra and Allah. And in the right corner, it says Adonai Echad. That's Hebrew. He uses Hebrew. He has these little hints of Jewishness. There's one God is what it means. Little hints of Jewishness in his sculptures. And then we get to Henry Mosler. Who's seen the show so far? Go several times. I've been here since yesterday. I've seen it 3 times. And this is at the front when you come in. This is the sort of largest piece of evidence of Mosler's affiliation with the Jewish community. He's way less Jewish than Ezekiel. Ezekiel was raised Orthodox. But Mosler felt connected to his Jewishness in other ways. He actually said at one point, he was an eternal worshiper, but really his connection to God was through beauty and art. And there's a really good quote of his in the gallery. This is Plum Street Temple. This is Isaac Mayer Wise's temple. Isaac Mayer Wise from Bohemia, who brings Reform Judaism in many ways. He kind of makes it, he's one of the most important figures in Reform Judaism, and it's based in Cincinnati in the late 19th century. He is vastly important. He founds a newspaper, the American Israelite. It's still running today. And this is the rebuilt temple, B'nai Yeshurun, Plum Street Temple, and it was gorgeous. It is gorgeous. It's still in the corner, and this angle's it's an excellent angle to really see this Alhambra-style structure with the blue, like the sky and the scale of it. You can tell from these tiny little figures in the corner. It's not a big painting, but it's a really arresting. It's a riveting painting. I love it. And we're going to talk about Reform Judaism a little bit now. In Judaism, there are different levels of worship. Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and Orthodox Judaism are really the 3 main best-known types of Judaism in this country. Reform Judaism is the most relaxed in its rules, and that's what Isaac Mayer Wise introduces. So there's choirs and in synagogues, there's English read, not just Hebrew, and women aren't separated from men in the synagogues. His congregation, Plum Street Temple, B'nai Yeshurun, commissions Ezekiel to make a sculpture of him for his 80th birthday. Ezekiel's in Rome. Again, he's back and forth from Cincinnati. It's covered in the press. Whenever he goes back and forth, the New York Times has an article about it. He's hugely famous in Europe. He's decorated by 3 different monarchs. And here we can see him sculpting. We have this photograph from the archives where he's sculpting Wise, he said, Ezekiel wrote about this in his autobiography. He said, I drove to College Hill, and it was sweltering. I understand now, it's sweltering. And when he drove, he meant in a buggy, not a car. And then this is the clay model. This is most likely the first sculpture modeled by a Jewish artist of a rabbi ever. You can see a drawing that Ezekiel made of Wise, and that's one of the marbles. So he did, the original was a bronze, but it's a very hard sculpture for me to get a photograph of. In fact, I can't, and I've been begging for one for years. It's in a collection. They're not being very helpful, but we have this terrific marble one that's at the Skirball Museum, which if you haven't visited, you absolutely should. And there were several versions that he made, originally the bronze for the 80th birthday. Then the marble was commissioned later on by his son-in-law, who was actually a publisher of the New York Times. There was a second version, then there's a third version. And we have the version here in Cincinnati, and then there's one at Hebrew Union College in New York. And that's this one. He looks very jaunty, right, with his tie and his vest. And, you know, the seriousness of his expression. And then the final Isaac Mayer Wise affiliation, I think, is Ezekiel was commissioned to do a stained glass window for Temple Knesset Israel, which is in Philadelphia. And it was in memory of Wise. And this is just a drawing. The synagogue was ultimately sold to Temple University for their law library. The law library burned down. So I have no images. I actually put a note in the Temple bulletin saying if anybody has any image, like of your kid being bar mitzvahed and you're standing outside, I just want to see what it looked like. I don't know the colors. I only have this sketch. But I do know from my reading that originally up top, in the final stained glass, it said, "Let there be light," which was the motto for the American Israelite and Isaac Mayer Wise's motto. And then this Judah Maccabee is in the center. Ezekiel also made a clay model of that. Maybe a sculpture that was bronzed. We don't know. It's lost if it was made. But because of it was a metaphor for the strength of Wise and Wise's convictions and what he brought to this country for Jews. Mosler made a portrait of Wise's first wife, Therese Bloch Wise. It's from 1867. It's in the Skirball. It's gorgeous. It's really beautiful. Look at the attention to detail on the clothing and the lace and this pretty little still life in the corner. And Mosler uses, like a sort of blank background. He doesn't fill the background with anything messy or busy so that you can focus on the sitter. So Mosler's commissioned to make portraits of Jewish people in this community. That's the other connection. And Wise, we think, recommended him for other portraits. For example, he did a portrait of a different rabbi. We believe this is Bernard Alloway, who was an Orthodox rabbi. And this is 1869. He's very stoic. He's in much more traditional dress than we've seen Isaac Mayer Wise wearing. And there's a companion portrait to it. This portrait of the rabbi's wife, who would be Catherine Schiff Alloway. This is who we think these two figures are. We're pretty sure. And these would be hung together in a proud place in somebody's home. Once again, this one's interesting. When we think of portraiture, you're like, oh, portraiture's boring. Portraiture's not boring. It's not a fully frontal one. We get a side view. Look at, the kind of tint of purple that catches our eye. And what objects are with these sitters that make them interesting? What do we learn about them from what they have with holding or in the background or what they don't have? And what kind of likeness do the painters create? And these are very vivid likenesses that Mosler creates. Mosler wasn't just focusing on Jewishness, let's say. This is Invoking God's Blessing, Pilgrim's Grace. It's from 1897. As I mentioned, he's back and forth, Cincinnati, Paris, Dusseldorf, Munich. And he has a period of time where he's interested in American themes. And he was very meticulous. He did a lot of research. And so he actually found a home a home where he could paint where it was the period for this particular painting. He very carefully researched costumes. We're going to see that runs through his work. And this painting, it's a little bit darker than this slide. It's a little deeper in color. And here, so he's interested in these early American themes, and there's some sketches in the gallery that show some of that interest. He also did other works of art. For example, this is Forging the Cross. It's from around 1904, and you can see they're forging the premier symbol of Christianity. And it's also a really gendered painting, kind of interesting. We have the women that are outside the door, the men that are doing the work. Notice the difference in his palette. He has a varied palette. Really interesting painter, had a lot of different techniques. Sometimes he painted loosely, sometimes he painted tightly. But what I really want to talk about now is his work that he did in Brittany, France. So this is, we think, the first work that he did. He was in Brittany, France. The Britons lived there, the Bretons, and they were a group of Christians who were very traditional, related to the Celtics, and Ezekiel reimagined this specific people and connected them to the Christian Bible. This story, Le Retour, is the return of the Prodigal Son, and if you're not familiar with that story, the wayward son hears that his father's dying. He comes back to say goodbye. He doesn't quite make it. And this is reimagined in a Breton setting. So we have the father dying in there, or the mother, sorry. And here he is in his tattered clothes. Look at this, every detail is worked out. And this work is the first work of art bought by the French government for an American artist. That is a huge honor. He was way better known in Europe than he was in America. He was very successful. He had his own studio. When he lived in Cincinnati, he and Ezekiel knew each other, and he said to Ezekiel, okay, you're planning on going to Europe? Come with me to France. And Ezekiel chose to go to Germany and study there, and then ultimately go to Rome. But their fates could have been really intertwined in even more ways if they had gone together. But they were discussed in newspapers here in Cincinnati. Two great Cincinnatians were, two great Cincinnati artists, twice in newspapers. So here we have, notice the detail on this bed, this woodwork. Mosler collected lots of objects. He did studies of these kinds of objects. And here's one of them that's out in the gallery. And I think, I couldn't get good pictures of, there are lots of little small studies for other paintings, but seeing his working process, like we could see Ezekiel's working process a little bit with clay models, you can see way more of the working process through Mosler's sketches, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them owned by the museum. And Julie did a fantastic job. The exhibition really gives a sense of the working process. This is Mosler in his studio, and you can see some of the objects that he collected and that he would work from. Look at this beautiful woodworking throughout. This is Harvest Festival, and it gives us, it really shows a Breton custom. We don't know exactly what this is. It might have something to do with, there's a Breton pardon ceremony. It might be connected to that, but whatever the case, it's a pretty crowded composition. We can see the traditional costume of the people, and the sunlight, the light is really beautiful. The way it reflects off different figures, it kind of gives a sense of, the interest in light that Impressionists used. But we see the figures, notice the shadowing. It's been argued that Mosler was interested in this other kind of people, these figures, even though they're Christian, but they managed to retain traditionalism in a modernizing world. And as I said, it's been argued that has something to do with Mosler and his sort of watching the loss of Judaism in his mind. Reform Judaism was diluting the Judaism that he might have preferred. again, he wasn't practicing, but he still admired this traditionalist group who, despite all odds, they wore very traditional clothing. They lived in a very specific manner, despite what was going on around them. This is Morning, another Mosler from 1888. This is the same time, just to give you some context, that artists like Vincent van Gogh are painting. So post-impressionism, much more modernist kind of work is being made. And that might account for why, we know Ezekiel's making traditional work when Rodin is working. Mosler's making mostly traditional work, very narrative academic paintings around the time that Impressionism and post-impressionism is coming to the fore. And that might be why they have been lost to history. The Skirball Museum, Skirball Cultural Center in LA kind of resurrected Mosler. And the majestic works that you have here in this show is going to further bring him to attention. So this is a really kind of beautiful scene, influenced by 17th century Dutch work, these very intimate kinds of paintings in which you just see, families together. Look at all this sometimes it's hard to take in a whole painting. I can spend hours in front of a canvas. And here we've got some cabbage on the ground, and notice the shadowing and the little different anecdotes that are happening in this painting. But it's all within a specific context with this very interesting group of people that was attractive to not just Mosler, but other artists would go to Brittany. Among them, Paul Gauguin, who's a post-impressionist whose name you may know, but also another artist. These are some studies for Morning. You can't really see them, I know, in the slide. This is just to encourage you to go see them. But I wanted to bring in this one painting, aside from the ones we've been looking at. This is Jacob Meyer de Haan. He's a Dutch Jewish artist who was in Brittany around the same time. This is from 1889. And the point is that look at how different the style is. It's flatter, it's not very painterly, it's surely not academic. This is what's really in vogue at this particular moment, this kind of style. Jacob Meyer de Haan has also been lost to history. But I've been told this is a favorite painting. People really love this painting. It's in the museum. I think it's up almost all the time, not just for the show. And Mosler's really interested in courtship scenes. We have two in the show, and then I know of one other that I really like that I brought in. But he's in Paris, and he sees this Norwegian girl, and he must have been attracted to the costume. And it's this really interesting scene, the fair exchange, this little flirtation. And it's painted, the colors are beautiful. It's very lively. It's a really engaging painting. And these scenes of courtship that he paints, nothing to do with Judaism, but they just they're just very interesting. They make you want to look more. Here's another one at Stroll in the Park. This is from 1875 to 77. And this had a companion piece called Lovers, but we don't know where it is. But just like the lightness of his touch, and look at how beautiful her gown is. I think that this painting, the gown, kind of rivals some beautiful 17th century Dutch artists who are really good with drapery and materials. And this is in the show. So the last one was not in the show. This one is in the show. This is the Chimney Corner from 1893. And it has such a warm feel to it and an energy. And once again, the genre paintings of 17th century Holland, I think are a big influence on him. So you can go see it in the gallery. I hope you will. The light and the flirtatious look. And notice when you do, little details, like this straw that's peeking out of his shoes. This boy and that girl are pretty different. We have to see if opposites attract. She looks a lot more neat and together than him. And then I wanted to mention Ephraim Kaiser. I know this is coming out of the blue. You're like, what does this have to do with Moses Ezekiel and Henry Mosler? This is the first piece of original statuary that was acquired by the Cincinnati Art Museum. And is it ever out, Julie? So is by a Jewish artist. And this is Ephraim Kaiser. He's also an interesting figure. I focused on just 2 Jewish American artists today. I could have focused on way more. There was, the whole point is that religious liberty allowed these artists to have the opportunities to go to Europe or to work in America. And Kaiser is another one of those artists. He ends up studying in Germany, and he makes marble sculptures, very academic. And this is a beautiful piece. I don't know if it's in good shape. It's large. You can see how big it is. And just, he's really good with drapery, and it's just a classical work. I found an old photograph of it, like in the gallery from 100-some years ago. That was pretty interesting. And another Kaiser connection that relates to Jewish American art in the Gilded Age and the opportunities afforded our artists, he was related to the Bachrach family. And the Bachrach family was a group of photographers. The oldest continuously running photography studio in the country is Bachrach Photographers. It's still running. And it's been running since the late 1860s, early 1870s is when it sort of codifies. David Bachrach was the founder. He took one of 3 confirmed photographs of Lincoln at Gettysburg. And we have that. It's in the National Archives. Jewish. And over the years, his sons continued the business for a very, very long time. They took every formal photograph of a president. So David did Lincoln, but successive family members continued to take portraits of every single president through George W. Bush, and then the tradition stopped. And it's remarkable. They took photographs of Amelia Earhart. Like, this was the studio to go to and get your photograph taken. And again, this is a Jewish American family. I think I'm running out of time, because I could keep going, but we can take as many questions as we have time for about these 2 Cincinnatians who really made name for themselves in similar ways. I mean, they're from the exact same generation. They were both born in the 1840s. Ezekiel died in 1917, and Mosler died, I believe, in 1920. They had just these incredible careers. Their roots are in this city. They studied in this city, especially Mosler. And we have so many great paintings and sculptures and works on paper by them. And I encourage you to visit the exhibition, learn more about these artists, and ask questions.
As to where Henry Mosler went to school here in Cincinnati. You mentioned that they both studied here.
So yeah, when they studied, I should explain, they studied with other artists, meaning they didn't go to like X high school or the name of a school. So you would be apprenticed with a artist or an engraver, and so they studied with different, figures in the community. And then but in Europe, there were actually art schools, right? There was more codified art education, and that's in part why they went. Mosler was a perpetual student. He studied in Munich, he studied in Dusseldorf, he had to go to Paris, he wanted to study there. He was constantly honing his technique.
I had a question about the painting called Quadroon. Mm-hmm. It was interesting how the text was given. That, to me, it seemed that so much of his painting was commissioned, and it said in the text, for white men, which I found interesting. So I'm presuming that he earned a large part of his living by doing commission paintings. Would that be correct in terms of his income?
All right, so how do artists make money? And she referenced a painting called Quadroon, which you can see in the gallery. I don't have a slide of, but it's a beautiful painting, and it's based on a poem by Longfellow. So please go check it out as part of the permanent collection here. How do artists make money? So when you're a sculptor, you basically are commissioned, because you can't just make a gigantic sculpture and hope someone's going to buy it, because it's too costly. You might make a model and it won't be bronzed unless somebody, people would come to Ezekiel's studio and potentially say, oh, okay, you bronze that blind Homer in his student guide, which actually did happen. But mostly, sculptors work on commission. Painters tend to just paint works, right? They paint works, they show them in galleries, they show them at the Paris Salon, where Mosler was a very successful salon artist because he was an academician, and hopefully people will buy them. But there are commissions too, like portraits are commissioned. And he would be, like Plum Street Temple, we don't know why he made that. It doesn't seem to be a commission. It appears that he just made it of his own volition. Mm-hmm. She wrote the text.
It wasn't a commissioned painting. He painted it for the salon, and the jury of the salon was white men. So he's trying to, and it was really the first year that he sent paintings to the salon. So he's trying to establish his reputation, and this is the subject that he chose himself in order to try to do that. So that's right. Some of his paintings, and Mosler, he sold paintings in a variety of different ways. The painting of the two children on the streets of Paris, a fair exchange, he actually did on commission for Knoedler and Company, which was a New York gallery, and he did a number of paintings on commission for them, in which they would trying to establish his reputation in the United States, so they would sell his paintings to U.S. collectors and commission prints after them that they would distribute. So there were various and sundry ways that he tried to use his work to make a living. You're welcome.
She has a question.
Really maybe became prominent only in the 19th century, because with Orthodox Judaism there was a prohibition against doing the human form.
All right, the question, if you couldn't hear, is do Jewish artists, American or European, only come to prominence at this particular time because as Judaism relaxes, the second commandment isn't adhered to so strictly? The second commandment in Exodus, thou shalt not create any graven images. So the very, very Orthodox Jews take that seriously, meaning no images, right? Because the idea was Jews are not supposed to worship idols. They just worship the one God. And paintings of Jesus, let's say, that would, or, Mary and Jesus, pietaz, that's not acceptable. And Jews didn't have paintings of narrative scenes of Abraham, whatever, the really religious Jews. So that is true. But the second commandment and its effect on Jewish art is not as grand as some people suggest. In other words, Jewish art was made over time. But if you're a diasporic people being kicked out of country after country and you're running for your life, you're not going to grab the canvas that you keep in your house and race to, the next place for your safety with your art. There were Jewish ceremonial objects that were smaller that could be saved. Jews made art. They didn't make necessarily like fine art that you would find in the French salon. And Jews didn't have the opportunity to become artists a lot of the time. They were not admitted into the art academies. They suffered from anti-Semitism. But in the 19th century, I think it's not so much about the second commandment. The second commandment does affect some people, and it actually affected Isaac Mayer Wise. Early on, there was going to be a monument to Judah Toro, and he kind of opposed it. It was a controversy early in his career. But then he has a portrait bust made of him by Ezekiel. So he relaxed his thinking. So I would say that the second commandment has maybe is like 20% of the reason why there's not this huge Jewish output of art, but then there's the other factors involved too. They weren't prevented. They couldn't enter the academy. They weren't staying put enough to really create collections. And if they had collections, they had to leave them behind. I mean, we do know, for example, during the Holocaust, there's so many incredible art collectors, and people. There's still news about reparations and getting your art back. There were many Jews who had tremendous art collections and sold their art. And there's a new book out called The House of Fragile Things that I recommend if you want to learn more about that.
Hi, good evening. We have a tradition in Cincinnati of art carving, and I noticed, and I don't know, this maybe goes to Julie or to you, I noticed that he was, it says he started a business, Henry Mosler, Engravers on Wood, on 225 Walnut Street, and studies at night at Lovey's Drawing School, and all that might lead into some of our art carving, for which Cincinnati's known. We have quite a lot here in our museum.
So, I don't know anything about art carving in Cincinnati.
I didn't mean to.
You want to know about jewelry? I'm your woman.
Perfectly fine question. The art carving has to do with the art carved furniture movement. Mosler was not connected with that. The engraving on wood was making wood engravings, which is a way of translating drawings into illustrations for magazines and for advertisements. Winslow Homer started his career making wood, doing wood engravings, and that's the kind of engravings that he was doing. Lovey's School was one of these little fly-by-night art schools that existed in Cincinnati in the years before the Civil War, and he did study in Beard Studio. Yeah, it was just a short-lived academy. Artists were kind of scrapping to study wherever they could. No, I think that was where he said his business was. It's in his record book that information comes from, and I haven't actually verified anything from city directories or anything like that. But that was the address that Mosler gave for his business. Of course, he's a teenager at the time, so it's kind of remarkable.
More questions? So if there are no more, yes, please, because I also want to add one last thing at the end. Yes.
So personally, I'm kind of curious. When I've been going to the art museum now for about a decade plus, but over the past couple of years, I've been kind of going through some more of the exhibits with, more of an adult eye and reading about the history of Cincinnati, Ohio, and kind of how some of these works ended up here. What was it particularly about Cincinnati in the late 19th century, and in particular how it may have been more receptive or more open to Jewish artists? Just like, what was it about Cincinnati that we may not hear about in the modern times to be kind of say, like, this is where a lot of art was happening, this is where a lot of artists came to kind of communicate with each other, to develop their works alongside one another? I'm personally curious maybe kind of what changed, because Cincinnati, although it's got a lot of art, isn't known today to be kind of, I guess, an art mecca as it seems like it was 150 years ago.
Well, Jews came here, so separate from the art, Jews came here because it was hospitable to Judaism. There were a lot of Jews here. It was a good place to settle. So, you have a Jewish community that's building. You have the institutions that are being built up, like, so you can eat kosher food, or there's synagogues. So Jews come here, and there happens to be art, a strong art presence with Powers, as I mentioned, or Beard, or Duveneck, who I know nothing about, and I should learn more about, because I think there should be a Mosler. There's all this Duveneck room. Like, there should be a Mosler room. And so Cincinnati, Hiram, who else? Wasn't Kirk Brown here too? No. So Cincinnati is an art. You might be able to address this better. I can tell you why Jews came here, but how did Cincinnati thrive as an art center?
We could go on all night about this. But, of course, the city settles because of the Ohio River, and industry is really what sort of brings, I think that the wealthy people who are settling here and trying to get their businesses going were interested in the arts as a way of developing the community. And they saw it as central to that. And that was really what did it. Patrons like Nicholas Longworth, for example, who were interested in seeing art thrive in the United States and making Cincinnati into kind of a mecca for artists. So I think that's what does it. I mean, in the late 19th century, there is a flood of artists leaving, and you have to realize that that's part of the story, too. I mean, these artists didn't have the resources that they would have had in Europe, obviously, and so some of them went and lived there, and took up permanent residence there. But they had patrons here in Cincinnati, so their artwork came back. Yeah. So I think we're probably ready to wrap things up.
Then I want to say one last thing then.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I want to say that I don't want to, a lot of these Jewish Americans, and there's way more than I talked about, there's plenty of these artists that were Jewish who were able to make a lot of art, and I mentioned besides Ezekiel and Mosler, Kaiser, and the Bachrachs. But I think a quote from Ezekiel to kind of sum everything up. He's proud of his Jewishness, he makes work that's Jewish, he works for Jewish patrons, but in the end, what he said in his memoir, I must acknowledge that the tendency of the Israelites to stamp everything they undertake with such an emphasis as Jewish art is not sympathetic with my taste. Artists belong to no country and to no sect. Their individual religious opinions are matters of conscience and belong to their households and not to the public. In reference to myself, this is my standpoint. Everybody who knows me knows that I'm a Jew. I never wanted it otherwise. But I would prefer as an artist to gain first a name and reputation upon an equal footing with all others in art circles. It is a matter of absolute indifference to the world whether a good artist is a Jew or a Gentile, and in my career, I do not want to be stamped with the title of Jewish sculptor. So I'm not doing that today. I'm just saying he's a great sculptor, Mosler's a fantastic painter, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you tonight.